The Ironclad. The sun shone high in the sky, unbroken by clouds, and no rain fell, unusual for NihtWyrtha. The clear weather did nothing to improve Beornwulf's mood as he stared at the Ironclad's hulking form. It sat in the water like a sleeping behemoth, its bulk appearing top-heavy, with sides rising sharply like the face of a sheer, flat-sided mountain. The forward section of the deck looked featureless from his vantage point, flat and uninviting. Toward the aft, long ramps bristled with fat, cylindrical barrels. The depth charges were as large as the rhinos that the iron hands drove around the island. Above them, the superstructure climbed ever higher, resembling the unfinished church under reconstruction in Fiskport. Two enormous cranes loomed over the scene, swinging pallets of stowed goods aboard. The ship's color added to its lifeless aura, a dull cloud gray that seemed to absorb the sunlight, broken only by the rust-red strip of the waterline where waves lapped in lazy rolling movements. It looked unnatural, like something dredged from the abyss rather than built by mortal hands. Beornwulf's understanding of technology had always been practical. He could grasp how gravitic repulsors could lift metal into the void above. A priest had once explained that in the weightless vacuum of space, size and mass meant little to brute force engines. Massive ships of iron could sail the stars as safely as wooden ships floated on the ocean. Yet here, on the open sea, the Ironclad defied all logic. He had grown up watching ships of wood cut through the waves with oars and sails. Wood floated. It was as simple as that. But this monstrosity of war was forged from iron, and even more impossibly, he was told a great portion of its bulk rested beneath the waterline. It was heavier than anything that had a right to stay afloat, and yet there it sat, placidly riding the waves. Surely, he thought, the Mechanicus must have hidden some kind of gravitic or hover drive within its vast hull. How else could it stay above water? There was no way something so heavy, thousands of tons surely, could sail as men understood the term. Even its presence made him uneasy. It felt as though it mocked the natural order, daring the sea to rise up and drag it down to the depths where it belonged. For all its might, there was an arrogance in its design, a defiance that seemed to court disaster. Beornwulf could only shake his head, his unease deepening as the waves lapped against the Ironclad's unnatural hull. He walked onwards, the hulk growing in size with each step. A group of children jumped onto the back of a Mechanicus hover vehicle, carrying crates and barrels marked Eisenwifre. An adept squealed in Binaric, and the tiny would-be Wigathan hopped back off sprinting in laughter as they chased in and out of the slow-moving traffic of servitor-pulled carts and other more unusual vehicles. He remembered the port of Weezer from the days before the war. It had always been a bustle, back then mostly fish catches and the usual accompaniment of sea-bound equipment. Today the Weezer dockyards were greatly expanded. Before the coming of the Imperium, the Navis Wellmare Wigathine was made entirely of wooden hull vessels, fitted with oars and sails. Some even had rudimentary steam engines. With the arrival of the Imperium, Magos Ductora Cogitatus Tiberius worked alongside Princess Hildilith and the shipwrights of NihtWyrtha to convert the fleet into ironclads, produced mainly at the Weezer dockyards. Eckbald had refused to institute reforms to the disparate fleet organization, butting heads with Tiberius over honor versus logic. Ships operated under different naviks, not a combined military force, meaning many ships had their own docks around the island. During the war, the Orcs introduced their own navy ships, a mimicry of the Ironclads. These fought in combined fleets, outgunning and outnumbering the defenders. So despite the naval prowess of the Wellmere Wigathane, the inability to act in formations without a unified command led to shattering defeats. Following the devastating defeat at the Battle of Broadmouthie-Port and the disaster of Suthihill, also known as the First Battle of Emerald Banks, the Navy, severely battered, was withdrawn to Weezer, the last port with dry docks still in imperial hands. Queen Hildilith seized this opportunity and undertook the Smirged reforms. She dismissed the incompetent Navarks who had held command through feudal loyalty and replaced them with officers selected purely for their strategic acumen and experience. It was at this critical juncture that Tiberius's controversial decision on Drakendelve proved invaluable. With naval forces desperately understaffed, The beastmen volunteers, experienced on wooden galleons on Drakendelv's winding rivers, became essential. Their familiarity with water navigation brought a unique skill set lacking in Imperial forces and allowed the NihtWyrtha to reach full operational capacity within mere weeks. Hildilith took command of the assembled ships and led the fleet in the Second Battle of Emerald Banks. The new queen, commanding her own ironclad Leotbora, broke the Orc line and reached the estuary, relieving NihtWyrtha, held by Chaplain Wulfgar and the Iron Hands. Empowered by capable commanders and bolstered by the beastmen crews, the Navis Hālgengas fought with renewed vigor during the Serpent campaign. The reinvigorated fleet recaptured or rescued all of the outer islands along the coast of the island, carrying out landing assaults with beastmen and wargs, supporting the Wigathane forces, with the Geofon secure and the orcs trapped on the island. Beornwulf was never a part of the naval campaign. After the Battle of the Forest Road, Tiberius had promoted him to Hlafopard, been made the Lord of Silthdale, which was without a lord and at the time in orc hands. Tiberius led a relentless land campaign, reclaiming mainland NihtWyrtha settlement by settlement. Wigathane forces in Skitaria were now supported by naval infantry, each advance tightening the noose around the orc forces. Beornwulf had fought alongside Braylin, the Skitaria Alpha he had met after Fugitive's Run, while the lad Sinwulf became his Huskarl captain, amalgamating Skitaria firepower with the Wigathane shield wall to great effect, becoming the template for the rest of the campaign. The fighting was brutal. With both sides now protected by void shields, the war became an intense infantry struggle. The Imperium's shortage of armored vehicles and the orcs' lack of metal, having already cannibalized their landing craft to construct a sea fleet, meant both sides relied on foot soldiers and close combat. Above in the void, the fleets of Manifold Dawn and Incoloris had regrouped, executing critical repairs and blocking any potential orc support. Finally, the remaining orc void ships were trapped between the combined fleets and Nithelm, which had remained in Imperial hands. After a prolonged barrage, the orc void fleet was annihilated. On NihtWyrtha, one by one, the orc-held settlements were liberated, culminating in the last stand of the orc war boss. Under the burnt gates of the hill fort at Suthihil, Tiberius, with his 3 pet wargs, brought down the war boss in a brutal melee. Though the orcs were defeated on land and in space, several squadrons managed to escape, fleeing into the ocean and beginning a series of pirate raids along the coast and on the Acer skips. The Navis Wigathane once again operated in defense of the island, as well as guarding the Acer sips. Post-war, Beornwulf now took up residence in the smoking ruin of Silthdale. The former Hlafopard had remained behind with his Hearthguard to buy time for the villagers to escape. After the war, the people had returned to Silthdale, including Beornwulf's sister, who had grown into a fine woman who had married a runesmith from the village and given birth to no less than 6 children. Whenever their famous warrior uncle visited, the children would shower him with hugs, while Grimhelm and Braylin made fun of the great warrior brought down by such tiny humans. Beornwulf, alongside Sinwulf, Grimhelm, and Oswald, had begun rebuilding the hall. Braylin organized her own Skitari to work on the village, doing to the ruins what she had done in such a short time in the forest. Grimhelm and Oswald had stayed behind to oversee the reconstruction and ensure the village's safety in the aftermath of the war's devastation. Sinwulf nudged Beornwulf's shoulder, the clink of their armor plates echoing faintly. His manic grin split his face as he nodded toward the Ironclad before jogging up the gangplank, tapping the safety chain with casual ease as he went. Beornwulf shook his head and spat, hoisting the heavy bag containing his weapons and clothing. He approached the gangplank warily. As his foot touched it, the plank shifted slightly, and he instinctively grabbed the chain. The movement was unnatural, unfamiliar to him. As he ascended the steep incline, the plank seemed to move in every direction at once, up, down, side to side. It unsettled him, yet he pressed on, step by careful step, until at last he reached the deck. He expected solid footing, but even here, on the vast deck of the Ironclad, he could feel a subtle, rhythmic motion beneath him. The sensation was alien, and it left him uneasy. Grasping a nearby railing, he took a moment to look around. From this height, Even though he was only on the main deck, the view of Broadmouthiport sprawled out before him. Servitors trudged through the streets below, carrying building materials, while engineers bustled about. Burnt husks of buildings were being cleared away, and here and there, the fresh wooden frames of new structures were being erected. A towering Heafadtredas moved with deliberate precision, stepping over rooftops to lower bundles of wooden planks and crates of thatch with its many snake-like mechanical arms. Bjornwolf noticed one of the Mechanicus crew leaning casually on the barrel of a heavy bolter, watching the work below. It was another reminder of how much his once peaceful world had changed. Even these mighty agricultural titans now carried weapons. Turning his attention back to the deck, he noted an autocannon mounted prominently in the center, its barrel aimed skyward. A group of gunners lounged around it lazily while a priest waved bundles of incense over the weapon, blessing it with solemn rituals. A servitor, standing nearby, affixed a fresh purity seal to the gun shield with meticulous care. Behind the autocannon loomed the first part of the Ironclad's upper superstructure. At its summit, a quad-mounted heavy bolter stood ready, its barrels gleaming with the sheen of recent maintenance. It had no crew for now, but its polished appearance suggested it wouldn't remain idle for long. Bjornwolf's gaze wandered over the crew. Some were seasoned veterans, lounging as though they'd been aboard ships like this their entire lives. Others, like himself, looked around in quiet awe at their strange new posting. Sinwolf stood nearby, animatedly chatting with a group of beastmen who seemed to be pointing out important parts of the ship. He looked absurdly pleased with himself, grinning like a child on his name day. Then Bjornwolf's eyes were drawn to the far side of the deck. There, leaning in an exaggeratedly casual manner, stood a tall figure draped in long, richly embroidered robes. Gold and jewels adorned his silvered armor plates, and by his side hung a silver javelin. The man exuded authority, royalty, or perhaps a high-ranking official, Bjornwolf thought. Beside him stood another man, tall and lean, but of a different bearing altogether. His stance was that of a warrior, feet planted wide for balance, muscles taut, and movements economical. His long hair was tied back in a knot, clearly to keep it from hindering him in a fight. A fresh scar ran down one cheek, glowing faintly red, marking a recent injury. The warrior's sharp eyes locked onto Bjornwolf, and the two men exchanged a brief nod, a gesture of mutual respect, one weapon-bearer to another. The richly dressed man turned then, his gaze falling on Bjornwolf. He took him in with a slow, appraising look. The dirt-crusted boots, the patched and weathered cloak, the dented armor, polished as best as battle damage allowed, and the tarnished warrior's ring hanging from his neck. His expression twisted into a sneer of disdain. With casual cruelty, he kicked a beastman who strayed too close while carrying a crate of ammunition. The beastman stumbled but recovered, continuing his task without complaint. The man turned away, dismissing Bjornwolf with a flick of his gaze, his attention drifting back to the sea. Bjornwolf felt a flash of instant dislike for the man. His hand tightened on the railing as he suppressed the urge to confront him. Before he could act, he heard it, the heavy, deliberate thud of boots ascending the gangplank. That unmistakable sound, the weight of an Astartes. The Space Marine stood in black armor, with silver accents, a large silver hand painted on his pauldron. His power pack bristled with two large mechadendrites, ending in claw-like appendages. Red-eye lenses in his helm glowed ominously, giving him the terrifying appearance of all the Emperor's angels of death. Bjornwolf recognized him, of course. He knew all 5 iron hands currently stationed on NihtWyrtha by sight. They had become such a part of local society that they were considered almost NihtWyrthan themselves. This one's name was Castor, though he had adopted the title Osric over the years, a nod to local customs. Osric was the patron runesmith of the Hlaford Geofon in NihtWyrthan legends. According to the tales, he had brought the augmented arms used by NihtWyrthans to wield the tools of the Great Forge. In those same legends, he worked alongside Wulfgar, the father of knowledge, who inscribed runes of power on the smith's weapons. The chaplain, residing at NihtWyrtha, had also taken that name in homage to the myth. It interested Bjornwolf just how much effort the Imperium, or rather the Iron Hands and Univoratrix, had gone to make a good impact when they first arrived on his techno-barbarian world. The Astartes removed his helm as he planted his feet firmly on the deck. Taking a deep breath of the sea air, he let out a hearty laugh. His gray hair was braided and tied in the fashion of NihtWyrthan warriors. He looked at Beornwulf and gave a nod, which Beornwulf returned with equal honesty. Then the Marine strode purposefully across the deck, hefting a massive hammer as he shouted good-naturedly at the crew lounging nearby. "The Emperor protects, but not those who sit on their rear," he bellowed, spurring the men into action. A tall beastman approached Beornwulf, stopping beside him as they both watched the runesmith enter the door to the upper works, bowing his head low to fit through the man-sized lintel. Beornwulf glanced at the beastman. He had the body of a man but hooved feet and a head shaped like a goat's. Small yellow eyes blinked in the light breeze, his muscular frame daubed with war paint, a custom of Draken Delve. The creature turned to him. "You Yiv Hlaford's men?" he asked, gesturing toward the Wigathane contingent from Silthdell assigned to the ship. Beornwulf grinned. "I am the Hlaford of Silthdell," he replied. The words felt strange on his tongue. The beastman bowed, a difficult motion for his frame. "Lord," he grunted in respect. Beornwulf slapped his arm in camaraderie. "No need to bow to me, and you, Hlesed. Don't have to call me Lord," he said. "I'm just a warrior like you." The creature straightened, looking proud at the sentiment. Ornak, Hlafopard of the beast host of Isenhuifre," he introduced himself. Isenhuifre was the name of the ironclad warship of the Navis Walmer Wigathane they stood aboard. Its name was a close approximation in Gothic to Iron Revenant. Beornwulf returned Ornak's salute as the beastman called his warriors to him and led them down the gangway to collect more crates of ammunition. Beornwulf watched them go before turning to the opposite side of the ship. The sea looked calm, but the storm on the horizon was drawing closer. A few drops of rain began to fall, speckling his armor. He pondered what the voyage ahead would hold. Isenhuifre, the ship rose high, its prow breaching the crest of the wave and cutting through the Geofon like a blade. Then its bulk drove into the mountain of water, crashing down into the valley the sea formed before it. The prow smashed into the depths, white spray cascading over the deck before the ship rose again, green water pouring from the scuppers back into the sea far below. On the deck, sailors clad in light cataphractii plate strained against ropes frayed by the fury of the storm. Beastmen scrambled across the slick planks, their hooves finding easy purchase, aiding the sailors with their tasks. Compared to the rapid rivers of Draken Delve, the NihtWyrthan storm was just another day. They barked and bleated in laughter as rain and sea spray washed over them. In the main hull of the Ironclad, water dripped from the ceiling. Beornwulf wiped his face with one hand, while his augmetic hand gripped a support post as though his life depended on it. The others in the room seemed unaffected by the ship's motion. Captain Edric leaned over the chart table, absent-mindedly catching a tin mug of ale that slid across the surface as the ship rolled. He pointed a finger at the map pinned to the table. Beornwulf glanced over it, noting lines and markers but no features. So far out to sea, the Geofon was nothing but endless water stretching to the horizon. He wondered how the sailors could tell where they were, or if they were simply guessing. He missed the land. At least on solid ground you could take shelter from the storm. At sea you were always in water, whether inside or out. Another drop fell on his head. Captain Edric continued. "The ship was lost in this area," he said, pointing to a red lumen cross projected by a servo skull hovering above the table. 3 more crosses appeared, 1 red, 2 blue. The red marked another ship lost, while the blue denoted sightings. Somewhere out there was an orc man of war. The main squadron in the region had been hunted down the previous winter, but one ship had escaped, or so the theory went. Something was attacking ships, and the Isenhuifre had been assigned to find and destroy it. The markers formed a line, leading to a yellow roundel illuminated by a second servo skull. This skull, adorned with cogs and parchment seals, marked it as Mechanicus property. It indicated the location of a surskips, agricultural ships that followed the summer sunlight with their fields of crops. Osric grabbed his hammer from where it rested against a wall that had nearly become a roof as the Ironclad rolled again. "Hlaford Beornwulf," he said in a booming, jolly voice, The Isenweafer will deploy your Wigathane to this Isser Sips, he said, jabbing at the yellow marker ahead of the supposed path of the enemy raider. The Space Marine fixed Beornwolf with a hard brown eye. You'll like it. It doesn't move up and down as much, he laughed. Then, added Edric, you will bolster the defenses and hold fast. When it is attacked, you will draw boarding parties in while the Eisenweaf closes in for the engine kill. Beornwolf raised a shaky hand in acknowledgement. Thank you, my lord, he said, gripping the beam again as the ship rolled. The tall man in fine robes, leaning with a relaxed stance against the bulkhead, spoke up. Your warriors are up to guard duty? Beornwolf turned to him, his tone sharp. My warriors will hold. The man grinned, a mocking edge to his smile. Oh, I thought you Land Wigathine were only good at running away. You need the Mechanicus to help you fight. Beornwolf sneered at the insult. We do run away, but when we get tired, we fight. Unlike the novice Walmer Wigathine, who leave ports to burn. The taller man scowled. I don't remember seeing any of your men at Smeargid Stethus when we won the war. You were still crawling through mud. Beornwolf grinned back. No, we were busy retaking Suthahill after you Navy boys left it to burn. The taller man stepped toward Beornwolf, his composure slipping. Beornwolf remained motionless, his expression calm, though his eyes stayed locked on the overdressed courtier. The man's scarred companion stood nearby, hands loose at his sides, not threatening, but clearly attentive. Osric's solid arm shot out, blocking the man's path like a wall of iron. Now, he said, his tone light but firm. Save your energy for killing orcs, not each other. You can do that later if you like. He insulted my house, the man said indignantly. Osric's voice turned serious. We all fought in the war, each in his part, on land, at sea, and in the void. We all fought, and we all lost. My brothers fell in the war too. Now, he glanced at the man, make an oath or recuse your words. I'll have no enmity on this ship. Captain Edric watched both men, his neutral expression betraying no allegiance. The taller man bowed in an exaggerated fashion. My apology, warrior, he said, spitting on the deck. Osric turned to Beornwolf. Oath or recuse to the prince. Beornwolf frowned. Prince? He questioned. Edric placed a firm hand on the table. This is Prince Heorowulf, son of Queen Hildolith, he said, then turned to Heorowulf. And this, my prince, is Laford Beornwolf, son of Voratrix, and the hero of Fugitives Run. Heorowulf looked unsure. He gave a short nod to Beornwolf, saying nothing before returning to his relaxed stance. His silence suggested he was weighing his options. Beornwolf felt a flicker of surprise. He had heard of Heorowulf, who had fought alongside the Huskarl Wigathine on the Queen's flagship. Stories spoke of his courage in battle, but he always took it for ego-boosting. After seeing him, he had no reason to change his opinion. He nodded to him, but said nothing. Osric laughed. Good. And yes, Heorowulf, you will take a party of your Navis Walmer Wigathine to support the Hlaford, and you will be under his command. His tone left no room for argument. Beornwolf couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this, some kind of power play between the royal house and the Astartes. The ship rolled harder than before, and he gripped the post tighter. Not for the first time, he wondered what he had gotten himself into. Ravens Beornwolf stood against the railing. The sea was still heavy, but he was beginning to get a feel for it. Wind whipped the tops off the waves, and rain came down in a light shower that looked as though it would pass soon. He was turning over Captain Edric's plan in his mind. He and his men would board a floating platform and defend it against attack. He had no idea how this should be done. He had no experience with Acer Sips and had only ever seen them from a distance. A bird, its jet-black feathers shimmering like oil, perched on the railing beside him. Farther down the ship, a beastman and two Mechanicus adepts worked near a small claustrum avium where black-winged creatures darted in and out, flying up to the masts and back again. From behind he heard a light footstep, boots with rubber grips, used by the Navis Walmer Wigathane. They were unlike the solid metal boots worn by his own men. Turning, he saw the scarred man, Prince Heorowulf's companion. The man stepped up beside him, the bird glancing between the two of them. Ravens, the man said, noticing Beornwolf's curious expression. We let them out. They fly high. If they fly away, it means they've seen land. Beornwolf eyed the bird. I thought we had auspex for that. The other man gave a short laugh. We do, but auspex can be warded. A raider ship out at sea will have dampening fields. He gestured toward the Raven. You can't ward a beast. Bjornwolf leaned back against the railing, looking into the clearing sky. He wanted to change the subject. Not that he wasn't interested, but he sought insight. What's going on with the prince? He asked. Honestly, why is he here hunting raiders? We've got a world to rebuild. The scarred man leaned on the railing as well. He wants to prove the royal house still has meaning. What's the connection? Bjornwolf said, gesturing toward the horizon. The other man scratched at his scar. He thinks the Iron Hands want to abolish the monarchy, replace it with a governor on Fiskballa Station, appointed by some high lord 100,000 light years away. Bjornwolf was taken aback by the honesty. And he thinks taking down a raiding orc ship will prove the importance of the crown? He asked sardonically. The other man snorted. No, the prince wants to prove the abilities of the novice Wulmir Wigathane to the Iron Hands. He hopes, by doing so, to transition the fleet at sea into a void fleet. He pointed toward the sky. Bjornwolf squinted at him, the rain easing off as the clouds began to break. And you think NihtWyrtha has a future in the stars? He asked. The thought seemed foolish. How could a tiny world like NihtWyrtha support a void fleet? It could barely maintain a fleet of ironclads. The man extended his hand. Phaond, first sergeant of the novice Wulmir Wigathane. Bjornwolf took his wrist, their vambraces clashing. I have a feeling, he said, that Prince Hyorowulf is more likely to hold on to power by joining the ecclesiarchy. He turned back to the sea. Both men laughed, but their laughter tailed off as they lapsed into thought. Bjornwolf glanced upward, noting a raven soaring high in the sky. Looks like we found land, he said. Phaond frowned, following his gaze. He stared for a moment before murmuring, That's not a raven. Bjornwolf shaded his eyes with one hand. The small black speck had stubby wings and a fan-shaped tail. It seemed to roll to one side, leaving a ghostly white contrail behind it. His eyes widened, and he turned, shouting to the crew around him. 2 arms. The bomber. Badfaller pushed up his goggles and tipped the bomba to one side, peering down at the expanse of sea below. The rain had cleared, an unusual occurrence for this horrible planet. His eyes darted over the surface, catching the faint glow of a curving line across the ocean. It was caused by the phosphorescence of the water, stirred up when a ship sailed through it. At the head of that dim, glowing trail was a human warship, one of the Ironclads. The ship was heading toward the cruiser. Badfaller thought about using the Vox to warn his captain, but he'd been explicitly told not to. The humans listened to Vox signals. That left him with only one option, and both choices were bad. He glanced down at the 5 buttons he had been expressly ordered not to push when he was on the deck of the cruiser. The big button was for special occasions, and the other 4 were for normal use. Which one should he press? He pulled his goggles back over his eyes. Mind made up, he stomped on the pedal and leaned to the side. Nothing happened. Muttering angrily, he switched off the autopilot. From the back of the cockpit, a Gretchen screeched in fury as the controls wrenched out of its reach. Badfaller kicked the pedals again, and this time the bomba rolled over, beginning its attack run. Below the ship was performing a wide zigzag pattern. As Bjornwolf ran to the nearest Mechanicus station, Phaond darted through the closest hatch. Bjornwolf reached the station and pulled the alarm lever. The servitor manning the station began turning a handle, and a siren began to drone. Other stations followed suit, and the ship thundered with the stomping of boots. Sinwolf appeared, Sepenta in hand, with a dozen of his men behind him. "Stay in cover," Bjornwolf ordered. On the forward deck, the quad heavy bolter pivoted as the Auspex servitor tracked the incoming orc craft. Crew members scrambled to ready the autocannon. Bjornwolf watched as the enemy bomber began its attack run. Captain Edric stood on deck, fully aware of Osric's presence behind him, but ignoring it. In the novice Wulmir Wigathane tradition, the captain held command, no matter who else was on deck. Phaond reached the bridge. "All ready, sir," he said. Edric removed his augmetic hand and replaced it with a direct Vox cable, linking him to all stations aboard the ship. This gave him instant access to the controls. In the lower pulpit, the engineer and Mechanicus priests monitored his readings, passing prayers to the Omnissiah. The bomber dived, approaching from the rear of the ship. The quad heavy bolters tracked it, unleashing a barrage of fire into the sky. The orc bomber darted through the hail of shots, a trail of tracer fire following it. The autocannon roared to life, exploding shells into clouds of shrapnel behind the craft, but its angle made it difficult to hit. Big Faller depressed the shooter's handle, and the twin-barreled weapon spewed plumes of water toward the ship's stern before sweeping across the deck. A Navis Wilmare Wigathine crewman was torn apart by the gunfire. Beornwolf lunged into the chaos, grabbing a servitor and a tech priest, pulling them down as shells ripped through the claustrum avium, scattering feathers around him. At the end of its dive, 2 bombs fell from the aircraft before it soared over the bow and climbed back into the sky, tracer fire chasing it. Edric pulled on the ship's rudder, and the lumbering bulk heeled over. 1 bomb splashed into the sea to port, the explosion showering Beornwolf with water, but the second landed squarely on the quad bolter. The explosion obliterated the weapon, killing its crew and sending shrapnel spinning outward, cutting down the gunners near the autocannon. Beornwolf ran onto the deck, checking on a crewman who was still alive but fatally wounded. He called for Sinwolf, who emerged with his men. The Wigathane removed the dead and took over the autocannon. Beornwolf manned the gunner's position while Sinwolf worked the sights. The engine powering the gun's movement was smashed, but the Wigathane braced against the cannon's flanks and pushed it manually. The bomber was coming in for another pass. The autocannon fired, the steady bang-bang deafening Beornwolf as he unleashed a volley. Shells burst around the bomber, and one exploded against its hull. Shooter rounds sprayed across the deck, but Beornwolf adjusted his aim. A second round tore holes in the bomber's fuselage. It flew overhead, releasing 2 more bombs. Adric turned the helm hard to starboard, then to port. The first bomb landed astern harmlessly, but the second passed under the bow and exploded in the water. The blast ruptured the forward hull, causing the deck to bulge and plating to shoot upward as internal pressure released. Beornwolf was thrown sprawling as the autocannon toppled, its barrel digging into the deck. The Wigathine who remained standing fired their Serpenta rifles at the orc flyer as it ascended back into the sky. Edric felt the ship slowing through his augmetics. The Eisenhufer was losing maneuverability, and the orc craft was already turning for another run. Phaon glanced at him, then at Beornwolf. The prince turned toward Osric, who was directing damage control crews, and left the bridge. Badfalla knew his bomba was damaged. He checked his fuel gauge, but the Gretchen with the oil dipstick lay dead on the deck. The gauge clearly wasn't working. He turned to his weapons. 5 buttons. He had dropped 4 bombs already. His foggy mind struggled with the math. Giving up, he grabbed the emergency abacus. 2 and 2 made, 1 bomb left, the one for special occasions. With grim face, he turned his craft. 1 engine sputtered and stopped. This was it. He aimed for the enemy ship and began his final attack run. Beornwolf emerged on the upper deck. The heavy bolter crew lay dead, their station coated in gore. He looked up at the bomber, then at Beornwolf, who was working to right the fallen autocannon. Making a decision, the prince threw off his cloak and yanked the wreckage of the bolter aside. He found one of the 4 barrels intact, though its train was broken. Using all his strength, he lifted it and aimed at the bomber, firing with all his might. Each shot staggered him, but he held firm, shells bursting out and ripping into the bomber's wing and fuselage. Ornak, the beastman, appeared at his side. The prince looked at him, and Ornak nodded, picking up a drum of ammunition and feeding it into the bolter. Despite the heat burning his arm, Ornak braced the weapon against the railing, allowing Beornwolf to maintain his fire. The bomber's left engine exploded as it spiraled out of control. Its last, massive bomb detached and fell, crashing into the sea with a colossal explosion that nearly capsized the Eisenhufer. As seawater washed over the deck, Beornwolf wiped his face. Beornwolf extended a hand, helping the prince to his feet. They looked down at Ornak, who cradled his badly burned arm, his yellow eyes streaming with tears he refused to shed. "This Wigathane needs a Medicae," Beornwolf shouted. Beornwolf leaned on the railing, watching the tail of the orc flyer tipping up as it sank beneath the waves. They had survived. The Iron Revenant. They did not need ravens to find the Acer sips. Thick black smoke on the horizon marked its location long before it came into view. The NihtWyrtha approached cautiously at half speed, its engines groaning as they pushed the damaged vessel forward. Engineers had sealed the forward breach in the hull with layers of patchwork plating, but the repairs were crude at best. Captain Edric had no intention of testing the ship's limits until Osric had declared it safe. As the NihtWyrtha drew closer, its movement slowed further. The vast platform of the Acersips came into better view, a surreal and haunting sight. The crew gathered on deck, staring out at the destruction before them. The platform's ballast towers on one side had been shattered, leaving the entire structure listing heavily into the sea. Waves rolled up the slanted deck, washing over flooded fields of wheat and rows of vines that disappeared beneath the waterline. The Acersips' fields, meant to feed the void-faring fleets, were in ruin. Some remained untouched, stalks of golden wheat swaying in the sea breeze, while others were shredded and broken, dragged under by the encroaching waves. Debris floated between the rows, including machinery and shattered sections of the ballast towers. Near the far edge of the platform stood a battered Void, one massive foot submerged in the sea, the other planted on what little dry ground remained. Its head platform, once a command station and symbol of stability, was riddled with holes and scorch marks. Smoke curled from its joints, and its crew hung limply out of the head compartment, some waving faintly for aid, others unmoving. Closer to the center of the platform, charred warehouses still smoked, their blackened frames collapsing inward. Fire licked the edges of a few, feeding on whatever material remained. Freshly plowed fields near the platform's edge bore long, jagged scars, where an orc bomber had crashed. Its crude fuselage lay in pieces, half buried in the soil, with its tail jutting upward at an odd angle. Trenches dug by its impact carved deep furrows through what should have been fertile land. Scattered around the bomba's final resting place were the grim remnants of a desperate defense. Skitarii lay in broken clusters, their limbs twisted unnaturally, weapons clutched tightly even in death. Their numbers were few, but the bodies of orcs lay around them, evidence of their ferocious stand. The ground was stained black with orc blood and a darker red where Mechanicus lives had been spent. Some of the defenders had fought to their last breath with precision-engineered weapons, while others had been overwhelmed in brutal melee combat. The scene painted a grim picture of the assault. Broken Mechanicus equipment, smashed cogitators, and ruined farming machinery littered the area. Here and there, small fires burned, fed by spilled promethium from ruptured fuel tanks. Overturned irrigation systems and toppled storage bins spilled their contents into the sea or onto the waterlogged ground. From the deck of the NihtWyrtha, Beornwulf squinted at the devastation. He could make out the haphazard remains of barricades around the central fields, where the defenders had tried to hold back the orcs. Piles of scrap metal and hastily assembled fencing marked their desperate attempt to protect the platform. Some barricades were blasted apart, others smeared with blood and burned black where explosions had ripped through. Sinwulf muttered at Beornwulf's side, "They fought hard." "They died hard," Beornwulf replied grimly, his eyes lingering on a lone Skitarii standard standing upright among the carnage. Its banner was torn and scorched, but it remained defiant, fluttering faintly in the breeze. He called down the hatchway. "Prepare a boarding party, we will need Medicae," he called, making sure his shield's maglock still worked after the battle. The NihtWyrtha let out a groan as it shifted closer. The sound of water sloshing against its patched hull, mixed with the distant crackling of fire and the creaking of the Acersips' compromised structure. Beornwulf and his men braced for what was to come. Whatever survivors remained on the platform would need immediate aid, and whatever had caused this destruction might still be nearby. The prow of an orc cruiser moved from behind the half-sunken platform like a monstrous leviathan rising from the abyss. Its silhouette was a jagged, chaotic assembly of rusted metal plates, mismatched armor panels, and jagged spikes. Its crude prow jutted forward, a huge ram, bristling with oversized rivets and half-functioning gun ports. Black smoke belched from crooked stacks along its spine, churning into the sky like a toxic shroud. The ship loomed larger with each moment. its hulking bulk emerging from behind the raised end of the acersips. The half-sunken platform had served as cover. Its damaged ballast towers had been deliberately holed to prepare this trap. The green glow of orcish glyphs and crude lumens flickered along the cruiser's hull, casting an eerie light on the destruction below. From the deck of the Ironclad, Captain Edric squinted at the behemoth, his augmetic eye analyzing the threat. The cruiser's weapons were crude but lethal. Massive turrets made of salvaged steel, their barrels uneven and blackened with soot, flanked its sides. Red glyphs and teeth-like patterns adorned its flanks, and racks of smaller guns, likely looted and bolted into place, jutted out in every direction. Even from this distance, the deep, guttural rumble of its engines reverberated across the sea. Its gun turrets began to swivel to aim at the Ironclad. Its keel cut through the waves with brute force, sending massive swells toward the wrecked acersips. The platform groaned under the pressure, tilting further as the cruiser advanced. Orc glyph banners flapped madly in the wind, and swarms of smaller craft, little more than ramshackle boats with engines, buzzed around the larger vessel like angry hornets. "Clear macro cannons for firing," Edric barked, his voice amplified by the Vox link. His augmetic arm tapped commands into the controls, transmitting orders to the engine seers below. In the belly of the Ironclad, servitors and mechanicus priests began the rituals of preparation. Clanking loaders fed massive shells into the ship's macro cannon batteries, each one etched with the Omnissiah's blessing. Red warning lights bathed the lower decks in an ominous glow as prayers echoed over the din of machinery. On the main deck, Beornwulf and his men braced themselves as the ship's engines groaned in protest, shifting to reposition the massive Ironclad. Sinwulf shouted for his Wigathane to hold position near the autocannon, ensuring they were ready for the inevitable clash. The cruiser angled slightly, bringing its broadside to bear. The massive turrets along its hull continued to swivel toward the Ironclad, the barrels glowing faintly as Orc crew worked frantically to load their crude ammunition. Smoke and sparks erupted from the cruiser's deck as its makeshift weapons powered up, and the air grew thick with the acrid smell of promethium. The Ironclad's macro cannons rumbled, their barrels adjusting to lock on to the approaching threat. The ship's hull vibrated with the energy of its mighty weapons, a sound that sent a thrill of anticipation through its crew. The cruiser opened fire first, its crude, oversized cannons belching fire and smoke as jagged shells screamed toward the Ironclad. The orcs' aim was erratic, their rounds splashing into the sea around the Ironclad, sending towering geysers of green water into the air. But some hit home. One shell tore into the Ironclad's side, rattling its patched hull and shaking the deck underfoot. Beornwulf staggered as the impact sent a tremor through the Ironclad, but he gripped the railing, his eyes fixed on the hulking orc ship. Edric's voice crackled over the ship-wide Vox. "Engine kill!" The Ironclad's guns thundered. Macro cannons unleashed massive shells, their concussive force shaking the ship as they roared toward the cruiser. The first volley hit the orc ship's prow, tearing through its jagged armor and sending chunks of twisted metal spiraling into the sea. A second volley slammed into its midsection, shattering a cluster of looted gun mounts and igniting secondary explosions that sent orc crew flying into the air. The Ironclad's macro cannons spat fire, raking the cruiser's deck. Orc crew scrambled to man their weapons, ducking and roaring as the shots tore through their makeshift defenses. A lucky cannon burst detonated a promethium tank on the orc deck, engulfing a section of the ship in flames. The cruiser responded, its guns fired wildly, some rounds streaking past the Ironclad into the open sea, others slamming into the ironclad hull, denting the armored plates. One shell exploded near the aft deck, shattering a secondary gun emplacement and sending shrapnel flying. Crewmen dove for cover as flames erupted, and damage control teams rushed to contain the fire. Beornwulf and Sinwulf crouched behind the ruined autocannon, their Wigathane firing relentlessly at the cruiser's exposed orc gunners with Serpentas, and above Herewulf manned the heavy bolter, propped up on sacks of ship's blankets with two Wigathane shields acting as gun shields. His sights followed a cluster of orcs hauling a massive shell toward one of their guns and fired. The burst tore through them, leaving the shell to roll and detonate prematurely, rocking the cruiser with an internal explosion. The cruiser returned fire, a volley of crude rockets streaking toward the Ironclad. One rocket slammed into the Ironclad's bow, gouging a deep scar into its armor plating and sending a spray of molten metal across the deck. Another struck the central deck, shattering a storage compartment and hurling debris into the air. The Ironclad shuddered, her hull groaning. The Ironclad's macro cannons roared again, their shots finding their mark on the cruiser's rear. The shells tore into its exposed engines, igniting fuel reserves in a chain reaction that sent towering plumes of flame and smoke skyward. On the Orc deck, fires spread, explosions ripped through its superstructure. Orcs bellowed and shoved each other, some scrambling to man their guns, while others leapt into the sea to escape the carnage. The cruiser listed to one side, its engines stuttering as its forward momentum slowed. But the cruiser wasn't done yet. A trumpet call went up, and horns began blaring. Funnels of water spouts shot out from the Orc ship's flanks, and Beornwolf initially thought the enemy had sustained a critical blow. But no, his amazement turned to dread as the cruiser began to submerge. It was a submersible. On the bridge, Edric could not believe his eyes. As the vessel slipped under the waves, he thought fast. Noting its direction and limited speed, he turned the Ironclad to take it over the cruiser's path. "Ramming speed," he ordered the engine seer, and the Ironclad surged forward. "Depth charges," he shouted. Down below, Osric muttered curses in Binaric as hull plates began to separate and seawater rushed in. He braced himself, his servo arms pressing against the buckling hull. Water was already up to his waist. The cruiser was gone from view, slipping into the depths, and the Ironclad sailed directly over its path. "Engine kill," Edric called. At the rear of the ship, the crew pushed out the ramps holding the depth charge racks. The engine seer rammed the activator down. The barrels were flung free from the ship's deck. The first barrel slammed into the sea, then the second, then third, dropping into the water on both sides of the ship. Osric heard the depth charges enter the water. Standing against the hull's side, he braced for the shockwave. He counted in his head. Then came the thunderclap of underwater explosions, standing against the Ironclad's compromised hull. Servo arms pressed against buckling plates as water continued to rise around him. The hull groaned and flexed, seams creaking ominously as energy rippled through the Ironclad. The water level surged upward, submerging him to the neck. The hatch to the aft sections was buckled, and he could hear water surging down the passages into the engine room. There was nothing he could do. Edric looked at the undersea auspex. It flickered, and the target diverged into two separate echoes with some kind of Orc jammer. The contact lingered below them, then vanished. If the Orc ship made a turn, they would miss. How smart were Orcs when it came to sea warfare, Edric wondered. He rushed outside and grasped the railing, looking aft as the sea in their wake began to settle. 6 rings of white, boiling water expanded outward, the wash from their passage rippling over them. He glanced at the chronometer. Time seemed to slow, the seconds stretching into minutes. The boiling sea subsided, turning into a rolling green sheet of water. No debris, they had missed. With a shudder, the Ironclad engines stopped, leaving the Ironclad silent, drifting on the rolling sea. Becalmed Phaond listened intently to the hydrophone, his eyes closed as he focused on the faint vibrations. After a long moment, he looked up and shook his head. Edric glanced around at the others, all crowded around the sonar pulpit. Beornwolf, who still thought this was some form of psychic power, broke the silence. "So, did they sink?" "No," said Edric, his tone firm. "There would have been an implosion, and the hydrophones would have picked it up. There's nothing." Beornwolf stood nearby, wrapping twine around his long hair, tying it into a knot. "If they moved away, we would have heard their engines," he said. "They're still down there, keeping quiet until we leave." The clump of metal boots on wood signaled Osric's arrival. The massive Astartes entered the bridge, his armor dripping with seawater. "Engine rooms flooded," he announced, his voice low and measured. "I have pumps running, but they're hand-operated. With the reactor underwater, we've got no power other than the batteries, and they'll last a day, if we're lucky." He wrung out his braided hair, water spilling onto the deck in small rivulets. "So we're dead in the water, then," Beornwolf said grimly. The others chuckled lightly, and Edric smirked. All Navis Hwalmer Wigathane ships have oars. We're still fully mobile. Bornwolf looked incredulous. So we just wait for them to run out of air? He asked firmly. Adric pointed to the horizon outside the windows, where dark clouds churned. That storm's coming, he said. We're on the edge of Laotzimer. The Aefenlang storms will hit us in a day. The Acer ships will founder, and we can't last long out in the open sea with oars alone. We need to be underway by then. He had a pained expression. The orcs will live to fight another season. A heavy silence fell over the group. Bjornwolf felt the weight of it, and the others' expressions suggested they shared his mood. The enormity of their predicament pressed on them like the growing storm. From the deck below, the creak of ropes and the splashing of boats being lowered broke the stillness. The Wigathane warriors, led by Sinwolf, began rowing toward the crippled Acerskips, a small party splitting off to search for survivors among the wreckage. Bjornwolf spoke, a hint of an idea forming. Before the Imperium came, he said thoughtfully, almost to himself, the Wigathane used to dive on the ruins of the ancient cities. Heorwolf finished tying his hair, the long braid resting neatly down his back. What of it? We don't have a bathyscaphium, he said dismissively. Bjornwolf looked hard at him, then tossed him his helm. We still wear the same armor, and I don't think we can let the orcs wreak havoc for another season on our people, his tone almost threatening. Heorwolf aimed his gaze back at him. You mean to dive on the submersible? He gave a sharp laugh. You land Wigathine are quite mad, as well as stupid. He said, shaking his head. Edric took his helm from him, fixing a breather tether, then handed it back, a knowing smile on his face, showing he agreed with the other man. Bjornwolf made a short bow towards Heorwolf. Of course, the decision is yours, my prince. Heorwolf held the helm, which was now in effect a diving breather. This was madness, but it was the right thing to do. He hefted the helm. Then we fight, he agreed. Osric watched the men talking and smiled to himself. These men made a good foundation, he thought, as he slapped them both on the back, laughing. Then fight we will, he agreed. Enemy below. The sea loomed green and dark before them, an infinite abyss that promised silence. Heorwolf stood at the edge of the boat, the waves lapping against the armored hull. Behind him, Bjornwolf adjusted the seals on his diving suit, the heavy plates hissing as they locked into place. Phaond and Sinwolf stood nearby, their faces shadowed beneath the glow of their helm lumens. The Acer ships groaned in the distance, a ghostly reminder of what they had to protect. We dive together, Heorwolf said, his voice muffled through the voxlink. If any one of us has difficulty, the others will be close enough to aid. Bjornwolf muttered darkly under his breath, testing the weight of his spear. He wasn't sure if he preferred being on the surface. Sinwolf slapped him on the pauldron. This is going to be fun. Bjornwolf grunted. He was beginning to suspect Sinwolf had been dropped on the head as a baby. The weight of his armor felt heavier than usual, as if the sea itself were already pulling him under. Phaond adjusted his helmet, the lumen array flickering to life. The ship shifted gently as Heorwolf gave the signal. One by one, they stepped off the edge and into the water. The cold hit like a hammer, even through the layers of plating. Air bubbles hissed and roiled as they sank, the surface above disappearing into a rippling blur. The weight of their armor pulled them downward, and soon the four were engulfed in a world of shadow and silence. The lumens pierced the darkness, casting long, shifting beams through the murky water. Schools of ghostly fish scattered at their approach, and the occasional piece of debris drifted lazily past. The rhythmic hiss of their breathing was the only sound, a fragile reminder of life amidst the oppressive silence. The lower they descended, they had expected it to get darker, but phosphorescent algae hung in the void, glowing in gaslioma. Phaond, closest to Bornwolf, gave battle sign, scanning the darkness with his augmetic-enhanced visor. He checked his depth gauge, signaling to stop. Bjornwolf turned his depth regulator and stopped descending, the sea below an inky black, the same as the sea above. They were too deep for the sun to reach. Heorwolf moved ahead, his movements deliberate and slow, kicking with fin-like attachments on his feet, each kick moving forwards. His lumen beam swept the expanse before them. Minutes passed. It was impossible to tell time properly in the depths, The seabed stretched endlessly, black above and below. Phaon pointed ahead. His lumen beam settled on something unnatural, a jagged shape protruding from the darkness, its surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. Algae had gathered around the machine, giving it a ghostly green outline. They moved closer, and the orc submarine took shape. The massive, crude vessel lay tilted on its side. Clearly it had internal flooding or weight had shifted. Even as they watched, it moved slightly towards righting itself. Not much, but visible. Its hull was a patchwork of rusted plates and jagged metal, adorned with orcish glyphs and crudely painted red markings. The long barrels of its deck guns jutted outward like accusing fingers. The damage from the battle did not look so bad up close. Clearly the destruction had been on parts of the ship that had fallen away when it dived. The group spread out, their lumens dancing across the submarine's warped surface. Operating at depth, small holes could lead to high-pressure water blasting into the interior, potentially rupturing bulkheads, damaging machinery, and killing the crew near the breach. Orc submarines, being crude, might lack the compartmentalization necessary to contain flooding, making them more vulnerable to chain reactions from even minor breaches. Hjorwulf removed his charge, a cracked grenade with 6 more taped to it, crude, but should be enough to crack a badly welded seal. He made battle sign for door and breach. They fanned out, pulling themselves along the jagged hull, each carrying a crack charge. Sinwolf worked quickly, affixing explosive charges to the hatches. His hands were steady despite the crushing weight of the ocean above. Phaon moved past him along the hull, scanning for weak points with his auspex, but the jamming was still in effect. Frustrated, he resorted to visually searching for vulnerabilities. Bjornwolf kicked with his ungainly fish-tailed fins, heading for what common sense told him was the engine section. There he came across a large hole torn by the Isenhuifra's macro cannon. He shone his lumen inside the jagged void. The interior was a chaotic mess. Boxes and junk floated near the ceiling in a small air pocket. It seemed to have been a bunk room, now filled with orc bodies piled at one end, likely killed in the initial blast. At the far side of the room, a hatch leaked a steady stream of bubbles from its edges. This was a weak point if he'd ever seen one. He touched the door, and it vibrated faintly beneath his gauntlet. The banging and clanking of tools echoed through the metal. Engineering work was clearly ongoing just beyond. They were running out of time. He took out his crack charge and stuck it to the door using putty. Fumbling with the detonator, he struggled to set the charge. What would have been simple on the surface now felt agonizingly clumsy in his sealed suit, his heavy gloves making his fingers feel like blocks of clay. Outside, shapes began to emerge from the algae-lit gloom. Orcs in diving suits, held together with rope, tape, and sheer hope, approached the hatch. They carried a large metal plate, slightly bigger than the hatch Bjornwolf was working on, and had welders strapped to their backs. The lead orc, wearing a literal fishbowl taped to his head, peered into the hole. He gestured wildly in battle sign to the others, but they looked back at him blankly. Frustrated, he smacked his hand against his makeshift helmet, then pointed into the blasted room and raised his axe. Understanding dawned in their small red eyes, and they drew their own axes, waving them in silent anticipation of battle. The metal hatch replacement slipped from their grip, dropping into the depths below. The orcs began hitting one another in blame, their silent quarrel punctuated by exaggerated gestures. The officer rolled his eyes and grabbed the nearest orc, shoving him toward the breach. The others followed, occasionally punching each other as they squeezed through the jagged opening. Inside, Bjornwolf finished rigging the charge. The device was attached securely, and the poor seal on the hatch would ensure a catastrophic breach. Satisfied with his work, he turned, only for his faceplate to bump directly into the fishbowl helmet of the orc officer. The red eyes on the other side locked with his, wide with rage and delight. The axe came down on Bjornwolf's helmet, but was slowed by the water, clanging against the side like a hammer striking a pot. The impact rang in his ears. Bjornwolf kicked out at the orc, drawing his seeks. 5 hulking figures crowded into the bunk room, their crude weapons glinting in the lumen's light. Bjornwolf brought up his blade, but a massive orc wielding a trident jabbed his arm, fusing the servos in his gauntlet and forcing him to drop the weapon. They swarmed him, grabbing his arms and clawing at his helmet, trying to pry it loose. Beornwolf thrashed, managing to grab a hose on one of the orc's suits with his free hand. He yanked hard, and the orc's suit imploded instantly. Its body collapsed inward, releasing a sickly green mist into the cramped space. Axes and blades scraped over Beornwolf's armor as the orcs pinned him down. The officer grabbed his leg and twisted. Beornwolf felt a sharp snap and searing pain as the bone broke. He kicked out with his other leg, sending the officer reeling momentarily, but the remaining orcs pressed him against the hatch. Their blows came down harder now, their leader working his blade into the joint of Beornwolf's helmet. Gritting his teeth, Beornwolf reached out toward the crack charge behind the orcs. If he was going to die, he would take them with him. His fingers stretched, trembling, but the charge was just out of reach. The orcs punched and clawed, their silent aggression filling the small space with oppressive intensity. Beornwolf panted, his voice barely audible in the tight confines of his helmet. "Emperor," he grunted as an axe handle smashed against his breastplate, forcing the air from his lungs. "If you ever cared for your subjects," he groaned, his strength waning. Blood pooled in his broken leg, and he could feel his vision dimming. His voice rose in defiance. "Fag word!" he shouted. The orc officer grinned through his fishbowl helmet as his blade found purchase in the seal of Beornwolf's armor. His jagged teeth bared in triumph, but then a crack split across the fishbowl's surface. His red eyes widened in an almost human expression of surprise before the glass imploded with a sickening crunch. His head disappeared into a burst of green mist, his body collapsing lifelessly. Behind the falling orc, Beornwolf's helmet emerged from the fog. His seeks darted forward with lethal precision, puncturing another orc's suit. The escaping air created a high-pitched hiss as the orc flailed, its limbs jerking violently before it was stilled. One of the two remaining orcs let go of Beornwolf to lunge at Beornwolf, jabbing forward with a rusted spear. Beornwolf, despite the pain shooting up his broken arm, hooked his mangled hand through the orc's air tube and yanked him back with a roar of defiance. The orc's swing missed wide, giving Beornwolf the opening to drive his blade into the orc's chest. The suit buckled and ruptured, releasing more of the sickly green mist as the creature crumpled. The last orc, wearing a makeshift helmet that appeared to be a cooking pot with spyglass lenses crudely hammered into it, turned to face Beornwolf. The two grappled briefly before Beornwolf grabbed the orc's helmet and smashed it into the bulkhead wall with all his remaining strength. Again and again, he slammed the orc's head against the metal until a wet popping sound echoed in the enclosed space. The pot came away in his hand, the orc's lifeless body slumping to the floor. Beornwolf signaled through the swirling green fog, pointing to the breached hatch. Beornwolf nodded weakly and gestured toward the jagged hole they had entered through. Together, they swam out into the open water, Beornwolf doing most of the work to pull them clear of the wreckage. Sinwolf spotted them as they emerged, climbing along the submarine's hull to meet them. He grabbed Beornwolf's other arm, helping pull the injured warrior away from the compromised ship. Moments later, Phaond arrived, swimming up with the detonator clutched tightly in his hand. Beornwolf reached out, placing a gauntleted hand over the device. Sinwolf followed, his hand on the detonator. Beornwolf looked at Beornwolf. The prince gave him a firm nod of respect. Beornwolf paused for a moment, lifted his remaining gauntleted hand, placing it atop the others. As one, they pressed the detonator. The first explosion sent shockwaves rippling outward from each breach point. The first charge on the forward hull did little noticeable damage. The second was out of view. The third on the upper works caused the metal of the upper hull to fold inwards like a deflating bag of air. But the last, a dull thud inside the breached hull, where the hatch imploded inwards, was the most devastating. The cruiser's engine bay, once roaring with crude but powerful machinery, crumpled inwards. Shockwaves shattered the primitive drive shafts and cracked the boiler tanks, igniting bursts of fire and steam within the submerged vessel. Funnels of water shot through ruptured seams, flooding compartments faster than the orcs could react. Bulkheads twisted and buckled under the relentless onslaught, and the jagged plating along the cruiser's flanks peeled away like rotten bark from a tree. The remaining power flickered and failed, leaving the cruiser in darkness save for the sickly glow of emergency glyphs. The pressure waves slammed into its patchwork hull with the force of the Emperor's wrath, crumpling weak points and ripping apart sections already damaged by the earlier exchange. Within the sinking behemoth, orcs bellowed and roared, clutching at anything they could to stabilize themselves. Gretchen screamed as water poured into their warrens, sweeping them away into the black depths. Those unfortunate enough to be near the breaches were torn apart by the sheer force of the explosions, their bodies pulverized against the collapsing hull. The cruiser dived towards the depth of the ocean. On the surface, Beornwulf removed his helm with one hand. He looked at Hjorwulf and laughed. The other man looked back at him questioningly. Beornwulf lay back as the Medicae gathered around him, Sinwulf pulling off his armor to get to his wounds. "The Emperor protects," Beornwulf said, still laughing. Hjorwulf watched as the Mechanicus Medicae priests carried him below and saluted. On the deck, Brother Osric watched as the four men moved inside. He turned grasping the rail, looking out from the Eisenhwefer's tall hull at the wreckage that still bubbled up to the surface of the sea, then at the red sky and dark storm cloud on the horizon, lost in thought.